Yeah, you are right. We are in Antarctica. And yes, we are stuck. It's been 634 days now, no internet, no radio, and no way out. It sounds crazy, right? But this actually happened. In 1915, Ernest Shackleton and 27 men became trapped here after the ship was crushed by the ice. What followed wasn't just a survival story, it was the most impossible rescue mission ever attempted, and somehow no one died. But there is a wild part. You are about to see how one man turned this frozen nightmare into the greatest leadership masterclass ever taught. You'll go from the moment endurers first got stuck in the ice all the way through the impossible 800 miles open boat rescue to the jaw-dropping moment when every single man come home alive. And yes, they survived 634 days with zero internet and zero help and zero guarantee they would ever see civilization again.
Roald Amundsen had claimed the South Pole in 1911. Robert Peary had taken the North Pole. But there was one prize left that could make him the most famous explorer who ever lived: crossing the entire Antarctic continent. This wasn't just about exploration for Shackleton. This was about money, fame, and proving he belonged with the greats. He needed investors, he needed headlines, and he needed to be first. The expedition would cost a fortune, but if he pulled it off, he would never have to worry about funding again. His name would be in every history book. What he didn't know was that his desperate grab for glory was about to become something much bigger. His greatest failure would turn into the greatest leadership story ever told. His plan was ambitious beyond belief. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition would use 2 ships and 2 teams. Shackleton's main party would sail to the Weddell Sea aboard the Endurance. They would land at Vassal Bay and begin the 1,800-mile trek across the continent. Meanwhile, a second team aboard the Aurora would establish supply depots on the other side, at McMurdo Sound. 6 men would make the crossing, picking up food and fuel that had been carefully placed along their route. It was a master plan that required perfect timing and flawless execution. Shackleton bought a sturdy 300-ton barquentine called Polaris. She had been built in Norway as an Arctic cruise ship for wealthy tourists. He renamed her Endurance after his family motto: "By endurance we conquer." When World War I broke out in August 1914, many thought the expedition should be cancelled. But Winston Churchill himself, the First Lord of the Admiralty, told Shackleton to proceed. On the 8th of August 1914, as Europe plunged into war, the Endurance quietly slipped away from London's docks. Men who had no idea they were sailing toward the greatest survival story in human history. There was Frank Worsley, the ship's captain and master navigator from New Zealand. Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer, whose camera would capture their nightmare. Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist who kept spirits up with his banjo playing. Tom Crane, the tough Irishman who had already survived 2 Antarctic expeditions. Harry Macnish, the ship's carpenter, whose skills would save their lives. And Frank Wild, Shackleton's second in command and most trusted friend. These weren't just crew members, they would become brothers in the fight for survival that was coming. The Endurance stopped first in Buenos Aires, then at the remote whaling station of South Georgia Island. On the 5th of December 1914, they departed for Antarctica. The long days of preparation were over. The adventure lay ahead. Just 2 days later, Shackleton was concerned by the sight of pack ice much further north than expected. The ice was behaving strangely that year. Summer had come, but instead of melting, the ice was getting thicker and more aggressive, like the continent itself was planning to trap them. By the 14th of December, the ice was thick enough to halt the ship for 24 hours. 3 days later, they were stopped again. Shackleton wrote in his diary, "What we were actually encountering was fairly dense pack of a very obstinate character." For weeks, the Endurance worked its way through the pack ice, averaging less than 30 miles a day. The crew took turns ramming through ice floes and backing up to try again. It was exhausting, dangerous work. On the 15th of January 1915, they were within 200 miles of their destination at Vassal Bay, so close they could almost taste victory. 3 days later, after sheltering from a storm beside a massive iceberg, the Endurance made her final run. On the 18th of January, they entered thick, soft ice, unlike anything they had encountered before. The ship became completely immobilized. By the following morning, they were closed in on all sides by solid ice that stretched to the horizon. This was the moment everything changed. What started as Shackleton's quest for glory had just become a fight for survival. The man who came to Antarctica to make history was now facing the possibility of becoming history himself. Over the next few weeks, several attempts were made to free the ship. The crew took turns with saws and picks, trying to cut channels through the ice. It was backbreaking work in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees, but it was ultimately futile. By late February, Shackleton made a decision that sealed their fate. The consumption of coal and manpower was too great. The risk of damage to the ship was becoming dangerous. The Endurance's boilers were extinguished. They were now committed to drift with the ice. Where will the vagrant winds and currents carry the ship during the long winter months ahead of us? Shackleton wrote, "These were momentous questions for 28 men trapped in the most remote place on Earth. The Endurance had become a floating prison, drifting helplessly with massive ice chunks, hundreds of miles from any land. All 28 men could do was watch through the windows as their ship groaned and creaked under the pressure building up around them. Initially, the ship drifted south, coming within 60 miles of their planned landing spot. Then the ice carried them 130 miles northwest. They were moving, but in the wrong direction, away from their goal and away from any hope of rescue. The ship's normal routine was abandoned as the crew settled in for the long Antarctic winter. Men and dogs took exercise on the ice every day. Special occasions were celebrated aboard with extra rations. Leonard Hussey kept up spirits with his banjo playing. Frank Hurley organized soccer matches on the ice and captured everything with his camera. But here is the scary part. As the months dragged on, something way worse was happening. The ice wasn't just holding them prisoner. It was slowly crushing their ship to death. Shackleton knew that other ships had survived being trapped in pack ice. The Deutschland of the 1912 Filchner expedition had been stuck for months before being released. There was still hope, but during July, after 2 months of continuous darkness, there were warning signs. After a large storm, vast slabs of broken ice were being crushed against each other by driving Antarctic winds. The pressure was creating huge ridges between the ice floes. The ice is rafting up to a height of 10 or 15 feet in places, Worsley wrote. The opposing floes are moving against one another at the rate of about 200 yards. Per hour, the noise resembles the roar of heavy distant surf. Every single day brought new sounds of wood cracking and metal bending as millions of tons of ice pressed in from all sides. The ship's hull started to buckle and bend. Water began creeping into the lower decks. For 10 long months, the men lived with this slow-motion disaster happening all around them. They tried to keep their normal routines going. They played cards, read books, and even put on little plays to keep from losing their minds. But deep down, everyone knew they were living on borrowed time. From late September, the ship faced unrelenting pressure from below. The arrival of spring and the return of sunlight did not spell salvation for the crew. Instead, it brought more violent ice movement as the pack began to shift and grind. Worsley wrote, "The behavior of our ship in this ice has been magnificent. Since we have been beset, her staunchness and endurance have been almost past belief. Again and again she has been nipped with a 1,000,000-ton pressure and risen nobly, falling clear of the water out on the ice. The Endurance was thrown around like a toy. Her beams arched upwards from the fearful pressure. Her sides opened and closed again, as she was actually bent and curved along her length. She groaned like a living thing, fighting for her life against the remorseless grip of the Weddell pack. After a brief glimmer of hope in mid-October, when the ice retreated and the Endurance floated in water for the first time in 9 months, danger returned with alarming suddenness. The returning ice immediately rolled her onto her port side at a list of 30 degrees. On the 24th of October, her sides were splintered as she jammed against a huge ice floe. Water from beneath the pack began pouring into the ship. When attempts to pump the water failed due to frozen and damaged equipment, Shackleton faced the moment he had been dreading. On the 27th of October, 1915, he gave the order that would haunt him forever: abandon ship. He told the 27 crew members to dump all but 2 pounds of their personal possessions. The only exceptions were Frank Hurley's precious photographs and film reels and Leonard Hussey's banjo. Everything else that had connected them to civilization had to be left behind. The so-called ocean camp was established on the ice. For the next month, the crew attempted to salvage what supplies they could from the flooded ship at great personal risk. They worked in shifts, racing against time as the Endurance slowly died beneath them. Then, on the 21st of November, 1915, it finally happened. The pressure became too much, and the Endurance gave up her fight. The sound was unlike anything the men had ever heard before. It wasn't just wood breaking, it was their lifeline to civilization being ripped apart. As the ship's back snapped in half, one crew member wrote, "This evening, as we were lying in our tents, we heard the boss call out, 'She is going, boys.' We were out in a second, and there was our poor ship a mile and a half away struggling in her death agony. She went down bows first, her stern raised in the air. She then gave one quick dive, and the ice closed over her forever." Shackleton gathered his crew on the ice and said something that would define the rest of the expedition. "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." But home was over 1,200 miles away, across some of the most dangerous terrain on the planet. There were now 28 men stuck on a floating chunk of ice with 3 small boats, limited supplies, and absolutely no way to call for help. What happened next tested every single limit of what humans can endure. Living in tents on the ice, the men faced a nightmare that would have broken most people within days. Temperatures rarely got above -20 degrees. Food was so scarce they were eating tiny portions of seal meat and penguin. And maybe the most heartbreaking part of all was that Shackleton had to make a decision that showed just how desperate things had really become. They had brought 69 sled dogs and 1 cat named Mrs. Chippy for the Antarctic crossing. These animals had become like family during all those long months trapped in the ice. The dogs had names like Sailor, Hercules, and Satan. Mrs. Chippy belonged to Harry McNish, the carpenter, and had become the ship's mascot. But with food running out fast and no chance of rescue in sight, Shackleton faced the hardest decision of his life. This wasn't the kind of choice they teach you about in leadership books. This was the kind of moment that breaks a man's soul. He could feed the animals and watch his men slowly starve, or he could save his crew and live with the guilt forever. For a man who came to Antarctica seeking glory, this was the furthest thing from glorious he could imagine. In one of the most gut-wrenching moments of the whole nightmare, he ordered the dogs and Mrs. Chippy to be shot. The men were absolutely devastated, but they understood the brutal reality of survival. Every single pound of food could mean the difference between living and dying. Frank Wilde and Tom Crean carried out the terrible task. The sound of the gunshots echoing across the ice haunted the men for the rest of their lives. Shackleton carried that weight so his men wouldn't have to. For months, they drifted on their ice floe, hoping it would carry them toward land. But the ice was totally unpredictable. Sometimes it moved them further away from safety, instead of closer. The men lived in makeshift tents, sharing sleeping bags and huddling together for warmth. They tried to march north, dragging the boats behind them, but the ice was too rough and broken. After just 2 days, they had to give up and establish Patience Camp. The name said everything about their situation. All they could do was wait and hope. Then, in April 1916, their worst nightmare came true. The ice floe started to crack right underneath their camp. They could hear it splitting and grinding beneath their feet. The sound was like thunder, but coming from below, they knew they had only hours before their frozen island would break apart completely. With absolutely no other choice, they launched their 3 boats into the dangerous Antarctic waters. The James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. These were small, open boats made for calm coastal work, not for navigating the most dangerous seas on Earth. For 7 brutal days, they fought waves that towered above them like moving mountains. Spray froze instantly into ice on their clothes. Winds threatened to flip their boats at any second. The men took turns bailing water and steering, but staying alert was almost impossible in the freezing conditions. Frank Worsley navigated by the stars when he could see them through the clouds. The rest of the time, they sailed blind through the darkness, hoping they were heading toward land and not out into the open ocean. When they finally saw the dark outline of Elephant Island through the spray and mist, it seemed like they were saved. But as they got closer, they realized this barren, rocky chunk was swept by constant winds and completely empty of peoples. Still, it was solid ground, the first they had felt under their feet in 497 days. As they dragged their boats onto the beach on the 15th of April, 1916, the men actually kissed the rocks and pebbles. Some of them broke down and cried from pure relief. But their relief didn't last long. This empty island was uninhabited for a damn good reason. No shipping routes passed nearby. No rescue ships would ever think to look for them here. They could survive for a while on seals and penguins, but eventually they would slowly starve to death. Shackleton looked at his 27 men. They were exhausted, frostbitten, and running out of hope. He realized he was facing an impossible choice. They could stay on Elephant Island and slowly die, or someone could attempt the most dangerous small boat journey in maritime history. The nearest civilization was South Georgia Island, 800 miles away across the Scotia Sea. Waters so violent that even large ships avoided them in winter. But here is what made this plan seem completely insane. South Georgia Island was tiny in the massive Southern Ocean. Finding it would be like hitting a target the size of a coin from the length of a football field while being spun around blindfolded. Miss the island by even a few miles, and they would sail right past into the open Atlantic, never to be seen again. But Shackleton knew it was their only shot. On the 24th of April, 1916, he picked 5 men to join him in the James Caird, the biggest of their 3 boats. Frank Worsley, the ship's captain and expert navigator; Tom Crean, who had been with Shackleton on previous expeditions; Tim McCarthy, a seaman known for his strength and endurance; Jack Vincent, able seaman; and Harry Macnish, the carpenter, who despite their earlier conflicts, had the skills they needed to modify the boat. As they prepared to launch, Shackleton gathered the 22 men who would stay behind and made them a promise that would define the rest of his life. "I will come back for you. No matter what happens, I will not abandon you here." Frank Wild, his most trusted friend, would lead the men left behind. Those men looked into Shackleton's eyes and chose to believe him, even though they all knew the odds were stacked impossibly against surviving this journey. The James Caird was only 22 feet long, barely bigger than a modern speedboat. Macnish had worked for days to modify it, raising the sides and creating a partial deck from wood and canvas, salvaged from the other boats. But it was still basically an open boat facing the worst seas on the planet. They loaded it with enough food and water for 4 weeks, though they knew if the journey took longer than that, they would die anyway. 6 sleeping bags, a small oil stove, and a few essential tools completed their supplies. What followed was 17 days of pure hell. The Southern Ocean lived up to its reputation as the most dangerous water on Earth. Waves regularly reached 60 feet high. Imagine a 6-story building of water crashing down on a boat the size of a large car. Hurricane force winds drove spray and sleet sideways with such force that it felt like being shot with ice bullets. The temperature never got above -20 degrees. Ice formed so thick on the boat that they had to crawl out every few hours to chip it off with axes because the weight would sink them. The men took turns steering the boat in 2 horse shifts, but staying alert was almost impossible. They were constantly soaked, constantly freezing, and constantly about to be swept overboard. One person always had to stay awake to watch for killer waves that could flip them in an instant. Sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford. Soon they started seeing things that weren't there from pure exhaustion. Tom Crean later said he kept seeing a 7th person in the boat who wasn't real. Shackleton himself started hearing music and voices that didn't exist. Their lips cracked and bled from the salt spray. Their hands got so frostbitten they could barely grip the ropes. Their tongues swelled from accidentally swallowing seawater. Yet somehow they kept the boat moving toward their impossible target. The worst part wasn't even the waves or the cold. It was the constant fear that the next wave would be the one that killed them all. Death was just one wave away, every single second, for 17 straight days. The most incredible part was Frank Worsley's navigation. He had to figure out where they were using a sextant, a delicate instrument that needs steady hands and clear skies. But in a tiny boat being tossed around like a toy, taking accurate readings was nearly impossible. He had to wait for brief moments when the sun peeked through the clouds, then try to steady the sextant long enough to get a reading while the boat pitched and rolled violently. Even a small mistake would send them hopelessly off course into the vast Atlantic. On May 8th, their 14th day at sea, something amazing happened. Through the haze and spray, they saw a dark line on the horizon, land South Georgia Island. Against all odds, Worsley's navigation had been perfect. They had found their needle in the haystack of the Southern Ocean. But as they got closer to the coast, they realized their nightmare was far from over. The island's shoreline was a wall of cliffs and rocky reefs with waves crashing against them with tremendous force. They spent hours searching for anywhere they could safely land without being smashed to pieces. When they finally found a small cove at King Haakon Bay and managed to beach the James Caird, they discovered a cruel twist. They had landed on the uninhabited side of South Georgia Island. The whaling stations where they could get help were on the other side, separated by mountains and glaciers that no human being had ever crossed. These weren't gentle hills. They were jagged peaks rising thousands of feet above sea level, covered in glaciers full of deadly crevasses and swept by winds that could knock a man right off his feet. 3 of the men were too weak to continue. McNish, despite his earlier work on the boat, could barely stand up. Vincent and McCarthy were suffering from severe frostbite and exhaustion. So Shackleton made another painful decision. He would take Worsley and Crean and try to cross the mountains, while the other 3 waited by the boat. If the crossing failed, all 6 men would die on South Georgia, and the 22 men on Elephant Island would slowly starve to death. What they attempted next is hard to believe. With no mountain climbing equipment, no proper clothes, and no map, the 3 men set out to cross terrain that modern climbers with the best gear consider extremely dangerous. They had a carpenter's adze for an ice axe, some rope, and their determination. That was it. For 36 hours straight, they climbed through a landscape that seemed designed to kill them. They crossed snowfields, glaciers, and mountain ranges in the darkness at times. They had to slide down slopes on their backs, not knowing if they would hit rocks or fall into deadly crevasses. They walked through the night without rest, knowing that stopping in those temperatures could mean freezing to death. Several times, they reached what they thought was the final ridge, only to see more mountains beyond. Their strength was failing, their food was gone, and they were starting to stumble from pure exhaustion. But Shackleton kept pushing them forward with one simple reminder: 25 men were counting on them. Failure was not an option. Finally, in the early morning hours of May 20th, 1916, they heard something that seemed impossible. A steam whistle from the whaling station at Stromness. It was the sound of civilization, of rescue, of hope. They had actually done it. They had crossed the uncrossable mountains and reached help. But when the 3 men stumbled into the whaling station, the workers didn't recognize them as human beings. They had been transformed by their ordeal into something barely recognizable. Skeletal figures with wild hair and beards, clothes hanging in tatters, and faces blackened by frostbite and sun. It was only when one of them spoke that the whalers realized what they were looking at. "My name is Shackleton," he said, and those words changed everything. The story should have ended there with celebration and relief. But for Shackleton, the most important work was just beginning. He had made a promise to 22 men stuck on Elephant Island, and he was going to keep it no matter what it cost him. The problem was that Elephant Island was surrounded by pack ice, and it was now the middle of Antarctic winter. The first rescue attempt in the whaling ship Southern Sky was turned back by ice too thick to penetrate. The second attempt in the Uruguayan ship Instituto de Pesca also failed. The third attempt in the British ship Emma failed as well. For 4 long months, Shackleton tried rescue attempt after rescue attempt. Each failure tortured him with thoughts of his men slowly starving on that barren rock. Meanwhile, on Elephant Island, Frank Wild was leading the 22 men in their own fight for survival. They had built a shelter from their overturned boats and stones, but it barely protected them from the Antarctic winter. Food was so scarce, they were eating seaweed, limpets, and whatever seals they could catch. Some of the men were showing signs of severe malnutrition and frostbite. But Wild kept their spirits up with the same words every morning: "Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today." Finally, on the 30th of August, 1916, the Chilean steam tug Yelcho managed to break through the ice and reach Elephant Island. When the men spotted the ship through the Antarctic mist, they could hardly believe their eyes. They had been stranded for over 4 months, and many had started to think they would die on that rock. As the rescue ship got closer, Shackleton stood on the bow counting heads through his binoculars. 1, 2, 3. His heart pounded with each face he recognized. When he reached 22, he turned to the ship's captain and said something that showed the true measure of his leadership. "They are all there, all safe, all well." Not one man had been lost. In 634 days of the most extreme survival conditions imaginable, Shackleton had brought every single member of his expedition home alive. It was a feat of leadership and endurance that has never been matched in the history of exploration. The men on Elephant Island were so weak they had to be carried aboard the rescue ship. Some could barely speak. Others wept openly at the sight of their leader. But they were alive. Every single one of them was alive. But maybe the most remarkable part of the whole story is what it shows us about human nature. Under extreme pressure, these weren't superhuman beings. They were ordinary men who found extraordinary strength when they needed it most. They showed that leadership isn't about yelling orders or being the toughest person in the room. It is about making sure everyone else survives, even when survival seems completely impossible. Shackleton never achieved his original goal of crossing Antarctica. That honor would go to other explorers decades later. But he accomplished something way more important. He proved that no matter how desperate the situation gets, no matter how impossible the odds look, human beings can endure and triumph through courage, sacrifice, and an absolute refusal to abandon each other. When Shackleton died 6 years later during another expedition in 1922, he was buried on South Georgia Island, the place where he had saved his men and kept his promise. His grave marker has a simple inscription from Robert Browning: "I hold that a man should strive to the uttermost for his life-set prize." The irony of it all was perfect. Shackleton never got his newspaper headlines for crossing Antarctica. He never became famous for being first at anything. Instead, he became legendary for something much more important, for refusing to let a single man die under his command, the glory he was chasing. He got it anyway, just not how he expected. Not for conquering Antarctica, but for conquering the impossible. Not for being the fastest or the first, but for being the leader who brought everyone home when bringing anyone home seemed hopeless. Sometimes the thing you are desperately chasing finds you when you stop chasing it and start doing what is right. The ship Endurance stayed lost beneath the Antarctic ice for over a century. But in March 2022, almost exactly 107 years after it sank, the wreck was finally found. Perfectly preserved in the freezing waters at a depth of 10,000 feet. Like the story itself, the ship had endured through time, waiting to remind us that some things are too important to be forgotten, and some examples of human courage are too powerful to stay buried in the past.